A little while ago, we made a list of 10 amazing games that barely anybody bought, and you guys rushed to the comments to tell us a couple of things. The first of which were the games on the list that you loved that you did actually buy, and the second was more games that deserved to be on the list. And so, as is tradition, we've thrown together a whole new list with your picks for incredible video games that deserve to be played and purchased by far more people than they were. Some of these games are relative unknowns, while others are huge names that were still considered commercial failures due to the expectations of their developers and publishers. Be sure to let us know down in that comment section which of these are your favorites, or hey, maybe mine the list for a few new favorites that you might never have considered playing. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 9 best video games nobody bought. Commenter edition. Number 9. PSI-OPS, The MINDGATE Conspiracy. 2004 action-adventure from Midway Games, PSI-OPS, The MINDGATE Conspiracy had everything going for it except timing. You'll alternate between traditional third-person shooter gameplay and utilizing your suite of psychic powers as protagonist Nick Scryer. Scryer is the soldier who's been recruited by the MINDGATE Corporation and needs to unravel a sinister plot, driven by the baddies, who are an organization called The Movement. Despite reviewing surprisingly well, including scoring GameSpot's award for Best PlayStation 2 Game of June 2004 and getting plenty of nods for Game of the Year categories, the game was a commercial disappointment for Midway. Only shifting around 400,000 copies in its first year of release, PSI-OPS struggled to compete with the heavy hitters like Fable, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, and Half-Life 2, which all launched around the same time. The game has since garnered a well-deserved cult following, but unfortunately, because of its commercial failings, any hope for the series to continue has been dashed. Even though the game does end with a big to-be-continued splash screen that flashes up during the credits, which certainly stings a little for the fans who did pick this one up. Number 8. Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth. Another cult hit that didn't receive anywhere near the amount of attention that it certainly deserved, Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth was a survival horror game that came out in 2005. Praised for its faithfulness to the Lovecraft source material, its tense and affecting atmosphere, and compelling psychological horror themes, the game just couldn't get off the ground commercially. Reports indicate the critically acclaimed game only sold about 60,000 units across all platforms in its first year of release, resulting in it being branded a commercial failure by developer Headfirst Productions. Hold on though, because it gets worse. When Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth was taking its 6 years in development, 2 other titles in the Call of Cthulhu series were being optimistically developed. Unfortunately, when Dark Corners of the Earth returned disappointing sales figures, both of these games were cancelled, when Headfirst was unable to secure a publisher for them in 2006. This led to the company declaring bankruptcy and subsequently liquidating, which is a pretty sad legacy for a cult hit video game. Number 7. Nier. Now, we've got to be clear when we're talking about Nier, as this entry refers to not the sequel Nier Automata or the remake Replicant version 1.2247, etc., but the original game, titled both Nier Replicant and Nier Gestalt, or simply Nier, depending on your region. We are not even into how complicated the story and mechanics of this game are, and I think I've already lost about half of you, but let's keep going. Nier originally released in 2010 for the PS3 and Xbox 360, and was created by Yoko Taro. Despite receiving mounting praise for its soundtrack, voice acting, memorable characters, and fascinating themes, the game didn't make any special waves commercially. Speaking after the fact, Taro clarified that they weren't in the red, but the game was hardly a success. The game shifted 134,000 copies within its first year of release, but even now, 13 years on, it's estimated that the game has only sold about 500,000 copies worldwide. To put that in perspective, the sequel Nier Automata has shifted over 6 million units between its 2017 release and March of 2021. Number 6. MURAMASA: The Demon Blade. Trying to get an action-adventure hack-and-slash game to rise above the already well-saturated genre in 2009 is already a feat, but putting said game on the Wii certainly didn't make things any easier. Such was the case for MURAMASA: The Demon Blade, created for the Wii by Vanillaware. The game was a hit with critics who adored the beautiful art style, tight, fast-paced combat, and Japanese folklore-inspired storyline, ultimately scoring the game an 81 out of 100 on Metacritic. Despite dazzling critics pretty much across the board, the game didn't manage to knock it out of the park with sales in either Japan or North America. Though at the time the NPD group reported that the game sold 35,000 units during its first month on sale, and this sat within expectations, this would later be revised by the game's publisher, saying sales were low across Japan, North America, and Europe. This was considered to be in large part due to the fact that at this point the Wii was falling out of vogue, and the untraditional nature of the game made it trickier to market. Despite returning some less than impressive sales numbers, the game is beloved by its fans, and even scored a re-release in 2013 for the PlayStation Vita called MURAMASA Rebirth. Number 5. El SHADDAI, Ascension of the METATRON. Ignition Tokyo released the 2011 action game El SHADDAI Ascension of the METATRON for the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC. The single-player adventure that was inspired by the Book of Enoch was praised for its interesting art style, compelling combat system, and curious and mysterious story that blended fantasy and science fiction. Despite impressing critics across the board, it's believed that the game didn't sell particularly well, shifting only 58,000 units in Japan at launch and 220,000 units worldwide. That classed El SHADDAI as a commercial disappointment for publisher Ignition Entertainment. This extended to the publisher being hit with a round of layoffs due to a series of commercial failures. Fortunately, there's a bit of a happy ending for this one, as the game's cult following helped along a spiritual successor called The Lost Child. The game was neither a commercial success, nor did it achieve the same critical acclaim as its predecessor, but it was a nice treat for fans of the original. Number 4. Gladius. Tactical role-playing game Gladius was published and developed by LucasArts in 2003. The game lets you create a school of gladiators and square up against opposing schools from different regions all over the game world. In keeping with our list, the game was actually rated as one of the, quote, best Xbox games most people never played by the official Xbox magazine. Even though the game impressed critics with its engaging tactical combat, satisfying progression and character development systems, and strong narrative throughline in its campaign, it fell far beneath sales expectations. Reports indicated the game sold less than 100,000 copies in its first month of release in North America, deeming it a commercial failure for the studio, even in the face of its impressive review scores. Though it may not have struck enough of a chord to invite a continuation of the series, Gladius is still a cult hit among fans. Number 3. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Although just about every RPG and vampire media enthusiast has tried their hand at Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines by now, the game massively fell under the radar when it first came out in 2004. Suffering from exactly the same steep competition that caused PSI-OPS to struggle in the very same release window, there was simply no competing with Half-Life 2, Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, Halo 2, and Fable for the spotlight. Even though Bloodlines impressed critics with its fascinating game world, mature themes, supernatural powers, and intriguing story, not enough people gave it a shot when it first came out. This was in some part due to the game's technical issues and bugs, but it's sort of just accepted that the end of 2004 was just not kind to non-AAA games. The initial release stood at a modest 72,000 copies in its first 3 months on sale, firmly solidifying what would become the cult classic RPG as a commercial disappointment. Dedicated fans ensured the game would not fade out of the spotlight though, as it has stayed firmly in the gaming zeitgeist and is still considered a must-play for RPG fans. The game even established a legacy where it's been cited as one of the major influences contributing to the resurgence of vampire-themed stories across all mediums. The fan-created patches that address technical issues and missing content from the original also helped the game from fading into obsolescence. Game director Leonard Boyarsky even voiced his appreciation for the patches, saying while they'd hoped the game would be more successful at launch, it felt more worthwhile to see how it stood the test of time and continues to inspire modders and fans. Number 2. Darksiders 2. This will seem like a weird one, since Darksiders 2 is far and away the highest selling game on this list. The action-adventure sequel was reviewed very well, impressing critics with its compelling story that followed the journey of death and its genuinely fun combat mechanics. Even so, publisher THQ had to file for bankruptcy just a few months after the game released. Of course, this wasn't all due to the commercial failure of Darksiders 2, but THQ did state that the game didn't perform to their expectations, even though at 247,000 units sold in its release month, it stood as the best-selling game in August of 2012. The game quickly lost steam, and the eventual 1.5 million units moved that year wasn't enough to keep the flailing company above water. Developer Vigil Games also went under as part of the company disbanding. In happier news though, the game was eventually remastered into the Definitive Edition by Nordic Games, who purchased the IP when THQ's assets were sold off. Number 1. Enslaved Odyssey to the West. Another perfect example of a game that both fans and critics loved but inexplicably sold very little is 2010's Enslaved Odyssey to the West. Developed by Ninja Theory and published by Namco Bandai Games, it was no surprise when the action-adventure turned out to be a slam dunk. Unfortunately, it was a slam dunk that nobody bought. Loosely based on the book Journey to the West, the game was praised for its interesting post-apocalyptic story and emphasis on narrative and character development. You take a stroll in the shoes of protagonist Monkey, who fights using a staff and must solve puzzles, explore the environment, and complete platforming challenges. The graphics were deemed to be stunning, the cutscenes understated and narratively impressive, and the soundtrack was described as elevating the gameplay experience even further. Despite scoring 8s and 9s out of 10 pretty much across the board, very few people picked it up. Though Namco had hoped that sales would pass 1 million copies, after 4 months they'd only managed to sell 460,000, and then after a full year they'd only hit 730,000 copies sold. These figures were deemed too lackluster to justify the continuation of the franchise or the planned sequel, which was ultimately abandoned. Namco later blamed the game's busy release window for its commercial failure. Game director Tamim Antoniades later reflected, "I'm not sure if the fantasy elements were a turn-off, the gameplay mix, or the lack of visibility. It was probably a mix of all three." That's the end of our list, but let me know down in that comment section if you can think of any other great video games nobody bought that deserve to be on this list. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter account where I'm @JessMcDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great gaming lists.